Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And this one is going to be an exploration of somebody else's life experience to give us some insight on something people ask about. For those of you who are new, I'm Roy Bahat. I'm a startup investor in the future of work, and I'm here with Max Chapkin, who Max's day job is a features editor at Bloomberg Business Week. He's just finished this book, which I imagine was a labor over some period of time, which is, I think, the first biography in this depth of Peter Thiel. It's called The Contrarian, published by Penguin Random House, came out just last week. And so, Max, the question that we want to ask is, and this is given Peter's known for having taken, some contrarian bets. He sort of defined the culture around that. One of the major questions people run into his work is, when should I decide and when should I wait and not decide? And so we'd just love to hear any insight from your research on Peter or other thoughts that help us reflect on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the question. Both just because it's obviously practical, but also because, Peter Thiel, who, as he said, wrote about for this book and spent, the last 3 years or so sort of thinking about how he became so rich and successful and acquired all this influence, and kind of how he works. And he has this reputation of being this exceedingly sort of brash guy, right? He backed Trump when no one wanted to back Trump. He went after Gawker. He saw PayPal. He's this kind of conservative bomb thrower. But then there's this other side of it, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about here, is that he's not that decisive. He's somebody who spends a lot of time kind of weighing the pros and cons and looking for an angle. And as much as he's known as this kind of tech venture capitalist, he's actually, I think it's probably more apt to think of him as a hedge fund guy, someone who's brought that framework. And by that framework, I mean thinking about angles, thinking about where the opportunity is and how you can sort of make your bet. Of course, Thiel famously loves to sort of go where the herd isn't, to bet against the current trends. And that's kind of like, why is it contrarian? But there have been lots of cases in his career where he's been sort of slower to react than you might expect. Even the Trump thing, Trump was like his third candidate in 2016. He backed Carly Fiorina, actually gave money to her PAC, gave a large amount of money to her PAC. So when she wasn't doing well, it kind of explored the possibility of backing Ted Cruz. Thiel and Cruz go way back, and only landed on Trump, later on. And so it historically, of course, it looks like, wow, this incredibly brash move, but it was actually a move that was very calculated. And I think a lot of times, go ahead.
Sorry. So just to ask about that, and by the way, if you have a copy of the book in front of us to show it to the viewers, would love to see it. But you picked the title for the book, is his reputation, and in tech and maybe elsewhere, but certainly in tech, he is known as a person who's been resolute. And I guess the question is, if somebody is, we'd all love the fluidity to change our minds, right? I mean, it means that it's less scary to decide. Something that my coach once said to me is the root of the word decide is actually to slay. It's the same root as homicide or suicide. And so you're slaying some options. And so despite this fluidity, where he says one thing here and one thing in another context, attacks the government, but then makes money off Palantir selling to it, whatever it is, he is known as this resolute contrarian. And so is your view that that's because he hardens into a position at just the right moment and is respected for it? Is that just a matter of his reputational branding and self-promotion? Is it something else? Just curious, how do you resolve that tension between his reputation and his fluidity?
Well, I think some of it has to do with branding, and I think that he's been super creative and smart about about personal branding, about being this kind of sort of like bad boy or whatever. But I also think that of course there are times when you make that decision, then it does become a big decision, and I mean, the pros and the cons don't really matter. So I suppose there is some truth to it. I also think that, while it's great to follow, the things that like really famous, successful people do, and Peter Thiel's certainly one of those. I mean, and I think we can talk about that without making a judgment about, we're talking about Trump as kind of an example of a good decision. Of course, not everybody is going to agree with that. But you can still look at the kind of the decision making there. But it's got him into trouble at times. And that's the thing about this kind of contrarian thing where you're always looking for an angle, is you could spend too much time, looking for that angle and not landing in the right place. So one of the most surprising things in the book, I'll just give you the story real quick. I mean, he called the economic downturn, the financial crisis of 2008, almost perfectly. Like, you can go back and read the things he read and read the things he wrote that his hedge fund published about 2008, and it's like bang on the money, and in a way that a lot of people thought he was crazy at the time, because he's saying banks are going to collapse and things like that, and yet he didn't manage to make money off of this insight. And the reason he didn't is because there was this thing of sort of looping contrarianism where the hedge fund had the insight, but then they couldn't figure out how to capitalize on it because they were worried that other people were catching up and that the market was going to bounce back. So then they bet on the market bouncing back at the wrong time. So it's kind of this thing where, like, at some point you need to cut off your options and decide.
I think the irony of it, of course, the business irony of it is, in the hedge fund world, he's known as not a particularly successful hedge fund manager. It's not exactly like people say, oh, look at his public market instinct, despite the fact that he's called things correctly so often. So I think there's that fascinating, maybe we aspire to be great at the thing that we are yet to be great at, or something like that.
Well, he had a very successful run. I mean, the thing is, he had a very successful run, and then the hedge fund collapsed, and then at the same time, Facebook took off. So that's part of the reason he kind of gave up on the hedge fund thing. But it's true. I mean, I think people who are really good, traders and stuff will tell you that, like, having the insight isn't the most, not necessarily the most important thing. You have to have a plan of execution, and that's where he failed. So it seems like another way to answer the question is maybe you have to make a decision if and when you have a plan to execute on that, on your insight or whatever.
The other thing is that he holds himself up as this kind of intellectual, and I don't know about a paragon, but he certainly holds himself up as reasoning things through in a dispassionate way. It also strikes me that one of the things to be aware of, and I've seen this in other contexts, I used to work for Rupert Murdoch, is that there seems to be some psychology at play for him, in good decisions and bad. And my sense of the book from the excerpts I've written is you're writing about an important figure. And so therefore, it's not about a criticism or a round of applause. It's about a holistic take on this guy. And one of them for him seems to be, and maybe this is where the contrarian thing comes from, is some opposition to elites, of some sense of, like, the traditional establishment is bad. And, maybe there's this dime store psychology if he was picked on as a kid and therefore, needs to stand up to it or something like that. But to what extent do you feel like personal psychology plays into this and people need to be aware of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the psychology aspect of it and kind of our own, the biases that we bring, obviously can lead us to good places, lead us astray. And I think there are cases with Thiel where it probably works both ways, where, as you said, the desire to kind of stick it in the nose of the establishment or whatever is, that can cause you to make good decisions, can cause you to make bad decisions depending on what's going on. I mean, I think, my feeling about, as I was working on the book and talking about it now, the psychology stuff is important, but I also think that, Thiel is a very smart guy, and most people are, they're more than just their own, biases and stuff. And I think the key, right, is to be able to channel, whatever you're bringing to the table. So I think for Thiel, right, he's able to channel that kind of, those feelings of anti-elite and stuff. And often when you're being smart about it or whatever, that works really well. And I think, when we think about, like, why is Peter Thiel so appealing to people? Because he really is. He has this huge following, people really, they hang on his every word. And I think part of it is that, he's managed to, like in 0 to 1, he talks about how the point of business is monopoly, right? Which is like a really outrageous, it's almost anti-capitalistic, it's a very crazy thing to say. And yet I think it really appeals to people because I think, deep down, they think a lot of people actually believe that. And there's this feeling, oh, Peter Thiel's telling the truth.
He says the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, it's kind of weird too, because he's not someone who screams authenticity. He's a citizen of 3 countries. He's a billionaire. Like,
well, and let's face facts. Facebook, if you want to pick investments in 0 to 1 based on monopoly, it's kind of like, hey, the thing that was started in the same year as 26 relatively identical competitors doesn't exactly seem like the first place you would go. And so, of course, in retrospect, it seems that way. But in prospect, which is when you make the decisions,
Right.
not so much.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely. But I do think he's got a way of kind of, and this is worthy of admiration and study and stuff, of kind of finding ways to be authentic in or finding ways to sort of to say the quiet part out loud, which of
yeah.
course can get you into a lot of trouble, and can be a great way to be provocative, and be a great, and I think at times is a great investment strategy, but probably not always.
And the other thing that I guess I'd just say is I think there's something psychologically satisfying when you make that kind of decision and it works. It's not that satisfying to do the thing everybody else does and have it works, but if you're the lone wolf and you go the other way, Bill Gurley always says, like, you got to be non-contrarian, you got to be contrarian and right, non-consensus and right. But it's like Uber seemed like a pretty consensus bet. A lot of other firms wanted to do that Series A when he invested in it. And
Yeah.
Snap, same thing, that kind of thing. And so I also think there's this thing that we tend to applaud it because it just feels so heroic when somebody's willing to stand up to the crowd, even if they're doing the thing that a lot of other people are doing.
Well, I also think what's one thing that's really valuable is just having an awareness of like what the crowd is doing. Because I think sometimes Thiel gets too much credit for being this kind of contrarian, because a lot of times he's not actually taking a contrarian position. He's actually just selling into a bubble. But of course, awareness of a bubble is like, that is a really important thing. And if you're aware of the bubble, you can either short it or you can sell into it. And at times he's shorted it and at times he's sold into it. But it's the same insight. It's like, what are people doing right now? And then try to find an angle, kind of on that.
I love that. Well, that makes complete sense to me. And, I think that's a great, like, jam-packed, this is not advice in the sense that you're not telling people live like Peter Thiel. You're saying, study this example. This example is worth looking at. And I think that's, the most powerful thing that we can offer. So thank you for that. Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, no, like you said, I think Thiel, of course, he's super controversial, and that's one of the reasons I wrote about him. It's fun to write about controversial figures. But I think, like, whatever you think about him and whatever you're feeling, whether you think he's a hero or villain or something, he's achieved a lot, and I think that demands respect, both if you're a critic or a fan. And I think part of that respect is, like, yeah, like you said, understanding how people make decisions and how they achieve things, because that's, no matter what you're trying to do, having that understanding is like a pretty good starting point.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you for that. And to be continued for folks who have other questions, about Peter Thiel or otherwise. We're here most days with a quick little snippet about a practical dilemma about work. And Max, I look forward to reading the next one.
Thanks, Roy. See you soon.